Hello, pocket knife community, knife lovers, knife enthusiasts, interested viewers. Folder here. Today we're talking about the baddest cutters in the knife world. Literally, in the entire knife kingdom, in all of Knife-dum. That's what we're talking about here. And what makes where is it? What makes the baddest cutter in all of Knife-dum, right? What attribute does a knife, of a pocket knife, have to be considered the baddest cutter? I mean, just, when I say the baddest, I mean, the best. I don't mean the worst. Well, we're talking about a knife geometry that just is unrelenting, unforgiving, and just stays on the cut. We're talking about the Wharncliffe. The Wharncliffe blade is literally the most prolific blade in the entire knife world. Right? Folding knife, straight knife, doesn't matter. And you know why that is? Because the Wharncliffe blade never gives up on the cut. That's why. It stays right on that cut. It's uncompromising, unforgiving. It is just brutal. And what do I mean by that? We're going to take the Giant Mouse Ace Jutland here. Love this thing. You got this upswept Arabian type blade. And we're going to explain why the Wharncliffe, which this is not, of course, is the most prolific cutter in the knife world. If you're cutting something, it could be anything, it could be my card here, right? It doesn't matter. With a regular blade, and we're talking about just the blade. We're not talking about wrist work, hand work, you changing geometry, nothing. Once you start to cut whatever you're cutting, at a certain point, that blade comes off the cut. Why? Because it sweeps up. Now, in order to keep that knife on the cut, you have to change the geometry of the blade. But with a Wharncliffe, and this happens to be a sheep's foot Wharncliffe, but it's a Wharncliffe nevertheless, it's a straight edge. And that straight edge cuts, 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 and it stays there. I didn't have to change any geometry, right? So that's why the Wharncliffe is the most prolific cutter in the world. And this particular Wharncliffe is a sheep's foot. I just use this as an example, but it's not really the best type of Wharncliffe, because what does it lack? It lacks puncture and geometry. It's such a sheep's foot that the front just doesn't have that ability to puncture properly. So you need to come out with we could use the smock as an example, I guess. Smock also a Wharncliffe. And also, right? So the smock also has that ability, right, to stay on the cut relatively, but we'll explain that in a little bit. But it also has puncturing geometry. The angle of the tip allows for the knife to be able to puncture, whereas the sheep's foot blade doesn't have it so much. Okay, so yeah, so anyway, that's the reason why the Wharncliffe is the baddest cutter in the business. And what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to talk about my top Wharncliffe blades. And there's three attributes they have to have. One, the steel's got to be good. Two, the geometry, of course. It has to be an uncompromising Wharncliffe. It can't be a Wharncliffe that has any type of release. In other words, and I'll bring the smock back out here as an example. The smock has a slight curve. When you take the smock and you actually put it on a flat surface, do I have a flat surface here that I can use? We'll use this envelope maybe, right? An envelope here, right? If you notice, the smock, the front of the smock rises up off that envelope. Okay, so even though it looks like a straight edge, and for the most part, when you're cutting something, it stays on the cut, there is a slight change. Well, if you're going to make the top 5 in my category, it has to be uncompromising. Complete straight edges, right? Okay. Got my Exceed designs here, and this is actually a razor, right? Has a blade in it. That's a straight edge. Okay, uncompromising. Well, the knives in this category all have to fit that criteria also. Okay. Just wanted to bring another Wharncliffe out as an example of a knife that looks like it could be in that top 5, but it's not. It's the Kaiser VK1FL frame lock, and this is also a Wharncliffe. And to the naked eye, it might look like this is a complete straight edge, but when you put that out on a flat surface, you will definitely see that the back rises up off the surface, and so does the front. Okay. It has a crown tip, so the piercing geometry of this knife would be considered pretty good, but it's not completely flat. So it's got to be completely flat to be the baddest in this category, right? Like I said, uncompromising Wharncliffe. Okay. All right, so we got a top 5 here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So let's just get started. We're not going to go into a heavy review of each knife. I've reviewed all these knives before. We're talking about strictly the Wharncliffe geometry of being the straightest, flattest cutter in all of knife-dom, right? And also, it has to have a puncturing geometry. The tip has to be, we prefer it to be robust. Okay, so here we go. All right, let's get started here. Where am I here? Okay. All right, so the first knife, well, number 5 of my top 5 Wharncliffes. Okay. I'm not doing an honorable mention here. I have maybe another 5 or 6 Wharncliffes that I'm not even going to mention because they don't fit that first category of being completely straight, like razor, like a single edge razor straight. All right. Okay, so number 5 is the Yojimbo 2 in crew wear. Okay, so this knife definitely fits in that category. It has a completely straight edge. Okay, this knife will definitely not give you any relief off that cut, right? When you're cutting something, you do not have to change that geometry one bit for this knife to do its job. And you notice the tip on this knife, why this is number 5. And partial reason is because the tip is extremely thin, I would say. So does it have a puncturing geometry? Yes, it does, but I wouldn't recommend using the tip on this thing too much. You can break it. Even though it's in crew wear steel, which is a tough steel, you still don't want to, remember, geometry beats metallurgy when it comes to toughness. But the Yojimbo 2 would be number 5. Okay, that's number 5. Yojimbo 2. Okay, so number 4, on our list of most prolific cutters, and they happen to be Wharncliffes, is the boom Spyderco Delica in K390. K390 is one of the baddest steels out there, especially for holding an edge. And the Delica Warnatech is definitely a knife that fits this category. Look at that thing. That is a straight edge. It is very sharp and it stays on the cut. Uncompromising. The tip also, if you notice, also is very thin, but the entire profile of this knife is very thin. Unlike the Yojimbo, which actually has relatively thick blade stock and comes to an extremely thin point. The Delica is thin all the way through, and contrary to logic, the Yojimbo is actually thinner in the point than the Delica. And that's the reason why the Yojimbo is 2 is number 5 and the Delica is number 4. Okay. All right, we're getting down to the top 3. And I'm going to tell you right now, these top three are bad. These are some bad Wharncliffes right here. Yeah, I think they could stand up to pretty much almost anything out there. Okay, number three on my top list of in my collection, the most prolific cutters in my collection is the 20 CV Warnatech. It's a Wharncliffe hollow grind 20 CV steel. Absolutely phenomenal knife. Uncompromising straight edge Wharncliffe with an extremely geometrically, maybe might be the word, correct. Correct. Almost cut myself there. Always be careful, gentlemen and ladies. The tip is much, you notice it's much more set up in a logical state than the Delica, 100%, and definitely over the Yojimbo. Okay, so yeah, that's number three right there. That's number three. All right, we'll get it down to the top two, the last two of my knives in my collection. Straight edge, basically straight edges, right? Basically. Number two is the most recent acquisition, is the Tuya Voodoo. The Voodoo, yes. This knife actually, the recent acquisition of this knife actually inspired me to make this video. Yeah, this is a true straight edge right there. Beautiful geometry, beautiful cutting geometry. And if you notice, the tip on this is stout. Yeah, it has a very stout, robust tip. So much more than the other three combined. So the puncturing geometry of this knife would be much more. I mean, there's a considerable jump from 5, 4, and 3 to number 2 when it comes to puncturing geometry. This knife would have much more prolific puncturing geometry than the other three. And of course, like I said, it's an uncompromising straight edge. Beautiful, beautiful tool. Really nice. But I must say that we're down to number one. The baddest knife in my collection, Wharncliffe. The Wharncliffes, which have the most prolific cutting geometry in all of Knife Kingdom. I will have to say that number one, I'm going to move these out of the way for number one. Number one is a big jump from these other four. Okay, even though these four are amazing Wharncliffes, all with the straight edge, this last knife, number one, and it's the reason why it's number one, really takes this to a completely different level. Matter of fact, this Wharncliffe, in my opinion, I think it's the best Wharncliffe in the market, and that's saying a lot. And I'm not talking about just in my collection. I'm talking about, I think, from what I've seen. I mean, if anybody knows of any Wharncliffes that exceed the specs that I'm focusing on, or the attributes, I should say, that I'm focusing on, and has better attributes than my number one knife, then put it in the comments. And the number one knife in my collection that fits this criteria is, drum roll, boom, Hendra XM 18 3.5 in the fatty version, Wharncliffe, Wharncliffe. Extremely straight edge for the most prolific cutting geometry. And if you notice, the tip on this knife is spectacular. As a matter of fact, it has a top swedge, right? It has a top swedge that meets the flats on the front tip that add ridiculous strength to its puncturing geometry. Okay? Yeah. That's a bad Wharncliffe right there. The Hendra XM18. It's in the fatty version. If you're not familiar with Hindera, the fatty version of the 3.5 is equivalent to the XM24, which is the bigger, much bigger, more robust knife. So what they did was they took the width of the XM24 and put it in the XM18. So it's got the XM18 overall size and length this way, but the width of the 24. So it makes it a fatty. And in your hand, the ergos on this knife are absolutely spectacular, and it has amazing cutting prowess, and the puncturing, like I said, is off the charts. And S45 VN is actually no slouch either. I mean, it's a little bit on the bottom end of the knives I just showed. They're all, I would rate them a little bit higher than S45. But S45 in the right geometry is, like I said, geometry trumps metallurgy. Okay, when you're talking about toughness, okay, when you're talking about toughness, a thick old blade in something that's not as good with toughness makes up for that metallurgy. Okay, so that's that would be my number one. Yeah, all right, so that's it. That's it. We got the biggest, baddest cutters out there, and the Hindera scores a victory on this one. All right, that's all I got, guys. Thanks.